Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Poll 101 American Government. This week, we're moving away from the foundational elements of American government and moving into the chapters on political behavior. So this week, we are discussing public opinion, and we have a lot of really interesting material to get through today. So we're going to start with a discussion about what is public opinion, and we're going to differentiate between words that are pretty commonly used interchangeably in our day-to-day lives. So we're going to talk about what the difference is between beliefs, values, attitudes, opinions, and how in the study of public opinion, those are all very different things. We're going to talk about where our political attitudes come from, such as various agents of socialization and the significance that partisanship, ideology, and group identity play. We're going to also discuss whether our political attitudes are stable or consistent. In other words, how easy is it to persuade Americans out of their opinions? Then in part 2 of the lecture, we're going to talk about political knowledge. How informed is the American public? We're also going to dive a little bit into conspiracy theories, since that is unfortunately increasingly becoming a rather common aspect of public opinion in the United States and elsewhere. Why are people seemingly more likely to believe in conspiracy theories these days? And then we're going to wrap up with a discussion about how we measure public opinion. You've probably heard various news articles or news organizations have stories about how we can't trust public opinion polls and they're unreliable. Well, we're going to break down some myths about that in this lecture and talk about how we identify quality public opinion polls. And how we can interpret this data when it comes to making informed decisions. And then very lastly, our last topic will be kind of like summarizing all of the information that we've discussed in today's lecture and put this into the broader context of politics. So based upon everything that we know about public opinion, should our politicians be responsive to public opinion or not? So there's so many great opportunities for discussion prompts in this lecture. I've tried to highlight them in various points throughout the slides. Can't wait to see what you guys have to say about today's lecture and reading. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and get started. First, let's talk about what public opinion actually is. We could come up with a variety of different ways of contextualizing or defining what exactly public opinion is, right? It could be a statement that you have on a specific policy preference. It could be a normative belief about the role that government should play or ought to play in our society, very much along the lines of the discussion that we had in week 1 in this course. It could be an expression of political thoughts, ideas, or values about various political actors or institutions in our government, or it could be a complex judgment process by which individuals consider and evaluate issues from multiple dimensions before embracing a specific attitude. And what I want you to notice about each of these statements here is that really each of these are tapping into various components of what we refer to as public opinion, right? Preferences are very different from beliefs, which are very different from values, which are very different from attitudes. In political science, these are each their own discrete concepts. So an attitude is the tendency to feel either positively or negatively towards a particular object or issue. An opinion is an observable expression of an attitude. It's taking an action of your attitude. Beliefs are thoughts or information regarding specific attitudes. Stereotypes, right, something that we haven't even talked about yet, are beliefs about specific members of social groups, often with a degree of prejudice here, negative affect felt towards members of specific social groups. Values can be understood as enduring beliefs that a specific mode of conduct is superior to others. Here's where we're starting to get into the worldview, right? The different worldviews that we have, kind of like we talked about in week 1, our foundational worldviews about human nature, for example. And we don't have too much time to get into the way that emotions affect our opinions, but emotions can be understood as the affective component of attitudes. And I'm sure that all of this sounds very academic and very overwhelming. And that's what academia is really good at. It's taking the words that we all use pretty interchangeably on a day-to-day basis and then giving them very abstract, complicated, convoluted definitions that confuse everybody. But here's what I really want you to know. Let's just focus on the difference between values, beliefs, and attitudes. So together, right, these can be understood as kind of concentric circles that at the very heart of an opinion, right? And just remember, again, we'll look at our opinion definition again. Opinion is an observable expression of an attitude. So for instance, when you get a phone call from a public opinion pollster and they're asking you whether you support the job that Joe Biden is currently doing as president, the idea here is that it is your values, beliefs, and attitudes that are all working together that ultimately shape that opinion, which is your response to that question, right? Either a yes, I support, or no, I do not support. You expressing that attitude, or, you can express an attitude by how you vote at the polls, right? So what I really want you to understand is that our opinions, for the purposes of this class, let's understand them as being comprised of our key values, beliefs, and attitudes. So values can be understood as how we feel about the correct way of life. How should someone, in their pursuit to live a good life, what does that look like? What are my key values? Beliefs are essentially value statements that we make about given objects, and attitudes are how we feel positively or negatively towards those objects. So again, this is all very abstract. Let's take an example. Let's break down the structure of an opinion on a topic like social welfare. So again, when we're talking about social welfare, essentially we're talking about to what extent should government get involved in our lives and help provide things that enable us to live a good life, right? If we become unemployed, to what extent should the government step in and provide us with temporary benefits until we can become employed again? Or if we're struggling to make ends meet and we're unable to buy food for ourselves or our family, to what extent should the government get involved and help us subsidize the cost of food until we get on our feet again, right? These are all examples of social welfare programs. So let's try to understand the structure of an opinion on a topic such as this. We're going to begin with the value, the way of life, right? So what is this individual's perception of the right way to live life? Let's say that one individual believes that independence and self-sufficiency are required in order to live a good life. That if you can't be independent and you can't be self-sufficient, well, that's just not the right way to live one's life. That can be understood as a key value regarding the way of life. Now let's try to understand a belief statement that might manifest from this value that independence and self-sufficiency are the most important things to living a good life. So for instance, a belief statement might read something like, government assistance programs like social welfare discourage people from living independently and self-sufficiently. So here we are applying the value to an object, the object being government assistance programs. And how might this manifest to an attitude, right? Whether we feel positively or negatively towards that object. Well, in this scenario, social welfare programs produce negative outcomes. Again, we are dealing with an object that runs counter to our key values. That produces a negative attitude. And then so when it comes to an opinion or an expression of that attitude, we might end up with something like, I'm not voting for candidate B because they want to expand social welfare programs. And based upon my beliefs and my key values, that is not something that aligns with my vision for how people should live their lives, right? So we've really taken a very academic detour into understanding how exactly it is that we form our opinions about various political issues, and that's really what I want to focus on in today's lecture. So I want to start with our first stop and think. If our values are so critical and so core to our beliefs, our attitudes, our opinions, well, where is it that you think our key values come from? So take a moment to stop, reflect on this prompt. Where do you think our key values come from? And hit play when you're ready to proceed. So I want to begin by talking about political socialization, because this is primarily where our values come from. And there's two aspects of our political socialization that I want to talk about. First, I want to introduce you to the idea of the primacy principle. This essentially means that what is learned first is learned best. So there's a reason I have the picture of a child getting ready to touch a hot stove, because from a very early age, what is learned first is learned best. So we have all probably at one time in our lives made the mistake of being a young kid, touching a hot stove, getting that pain reaction, associating that with a negative emotion and saying, I am never going to do that thing. What is learned first is learned best. Next, we have the structuring principle, which essentially means that what is learned first structures how you learn later. It influences your subsequent behavior. And this is why the events that occur in childhood are so profound when it comes to shaping our worldview, our key values, and beliefs about the world around us. So whether we grow up in communities with a lot of diversity, or we grow up in communities where most members have the same racial or socioeconomic background as us, that's going to have a big impact on how we view our country. And, whether we view others who are different from us as, are they out to get us or not? Or whether we grow up in a loving and secure household, or whether we grow up in an environment that is hostile and can't meet our basic needs, that's going to have a huge impact on our psychology and how secure we feel in the world around us. And this is why certain types of political messaging that prey on fear and insecurity and trauma are really effective on individuals who have this fearful worldview, or they have experienced some type of trauma in their lives which lead them to believe that others can't be trusted, or that the world is a scary place where others are eager to take advantage of your weaknesses. And there's lots of different agents of socialization that we could think about that help shape this worldview, right? Whether we grew up in a religious household, what our parents were like, what the family dynamic was like, the school that we went to, the friends that we associated with, geographic location, right? Whether we grew up in the north or the south or the east or the west, suburbs, or, grew up in a rural area, there's different cultures and values associated with geographic location. We could talk about factors of our identity like race, gender, our sexual orientation, our age. We can talk about economic factors like how wealthy we grew up, whether we lived in a home or an apartment, or whether we had summer vacations, or whether we had to spend the whole summer working on the farm. There's even a robust body of literature that suggests that there's a genetic component that influences our public opinion, which I'm not going to get into in this lecture, but if that type of stuff interests you, I do teach an upper-level political science course just on public opinion, where we have a whole week on genetics, which is really crazy. It's really, really cool research that's being done in that area. At any rate, there's lots of factors that shape our key values about the world around us. And based upon what those agents of socialization are, that generally funnels us into different groups that also influence even more how we think about politics. And I want to talk briefly about those key factors being our political ideology, our partisan identification, as well as our group identification. And so again, based upon your worldview and your key values and, the primacy principle and the structuring principle and how we grow up to perceive the world around us, generally that has a pretty big impact on our political ideology. And essentially, when we're talking about political ideology, really what we're just talking about are a set of beliefs about the proper order of society and how that can be achieved. Oftentimes, ideology is conceptualized as a left-right spectrum, where on the left we have our liberal ideology, and on the right we have our conservative ideology. So let's just break these down briefly. We'll get to these in more detail, I think, later in the semester, but just for the introductory purposes, when we're talking about possessing a conservative political ideology, what does that mean? Well, fundamentally, it breaks down to a few key things. One, a belief in personal responsibility, limited government, free markets, individual liberty, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. Individuals with a conservative political ideology generally believe that the role of government should be to provide people the freedom necessary to pursue their own goals. Now, notice that this is much different than how we conceptualize a liberal ideology. So according to the liberal view, there is a strong belief in government action to achieve equal opportunity and equality for all. It is the duty of the government to alleviate social ills and to protect civil liberties and individual human rights. And individuals with a liberal political ideology often believe that the role of government should be to guarantee that no one is in need. So again, this can kind of help us understand that individuals who grow up in households that are economically disadvantaged, why a liberal ideology might be appealing to those individuals. Now, most of the time, but not always, our political ideology will funnel us into different political parties. And in the United States, there is really a two-party dominant system here. So we can see how a conservative political ideology has come to define the Republican Party, which favors smaller government, lower taxes, and less spending on social issues. Again, because that key value is independence and self-sufficiency. Whereas when we look at the Democrats, this is a party that has really grown to encapsulate a leftist political ideology that favors big government, higher taxes on the wealthy, and more spending on social issues in order to appeal to that key value, that fundamental worldview that no one in a society should go in need. And because of centuries of systemic biases on the lines of gender and race and sexual orientation in this country, we know that group identification also plays a huge role in how we shape our opinions. So when I want to talk about group identification, when we're talking about that, we're essentially talking about the assignment of an individual into a particular group based on characteristics that are specific to that group, in accordance with widely held intersubjective definitions. In other words, group membership is based on how others in society would describe a person. So what we're talking about here are things like race, gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, and things of that nature. So let's just take a moment to explore some public opinion data at the intersection of race. Let's examine a question with respect to police treatment, whether individuals believe that the police treat whites better, the same, or whether they treat blacks better. And what we're looking at here on the y-axis of this chart are responses based upon the respondents' race in this poll. And on the x-axis, we see the percentage of individuals who agreed with these various statements. And so what's really interesting looking at this data is that at least 60% of respondents from each racial group agree that whites are generally treated better by the police. Not surprisingly, it is also respondents who identify as white who were most likely to believe that the police treat whites and blacks about the same, here at about 38%. When we look at every other racial subgroup, we see that the percentage of responses in the same category are much lower. What about attitudes regarding the state of the economy? About 40% of whites believe the economy has improved or stayed the same, compared to over 70% of blacks who believe that the economy has gotten worse. What about race and attitudes about spending on welfare? Well, about 1/4 of whites believe that welfare spending should increase, compared to blacks, who are nearly twice as likely to support increased welfare spending compared to whites. And so a question that I want to posit here is, why do you think that attitudes vary so predictably by race? We're going to get to this in just a moment, but if you'd like to stop and think now's a good time to reflect on why identity, in your opinion, plays such a big role in shaping our attitudes. And as much as I would like to make this an entire lecture where we just look at a bunch of data and charts and try to break everything down, we don't really have time to do that. I would really much more prefer you understand the terminology and the concepts of public opinion more than the actual differences in data. But let's just also look at some data with respect to race and gender when it came to how Americans voted in 2020. So here again on the y-axis, we have respondents' responses broken down by their race and their gender, and we see some pretty interesting patterns here. One of the first things that pops in this graph is just looking at how female respondents, regardless of their race, voted in 2020. When we look at white females, black females, Hispanic females, Asian females, and Native American females, regardless of race, we see a bit of a gap between men and women in each of these categories. We refer to this phenomenon as the gender gap, which explores men and women's divergent beliefs, values, and attitudes in politics. So there's an interesting gap here, right? In each of these, we see that women were more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate compared to men in their respective racial groups. And we could talk about why this is, right? Again, this is something that we would answer in my Women in Politics class, but why do you think that women are so much more likely to identify with the Democratic Party? In particular here, we can look at the differences between individuals who identify as black and every other racial category, that there is significant allegiance to the Democratic Party among black voters. So there's all kinds of really interesting stuff going on in this chart. I'd love for you guys to bring these up in the discussion board if you were so inclined. But what I want you taking away here is that group identity acts as the lens through which we experience, perceive, and understand the environment around us. That based upon our race and based upon our gender, that has a huge impact on how we perceive the world around us, whether we grow up thinking the world is a scary place that's out to get us, that has undeniable influence on our political behavior and our policy preferences, and all of these different factors are interrelated, shaping unique, predictable outcomes based upon our race and our gender, which we can observe through data as social scientists. Okay, so that was part one, where mainly it was an introduction to a lot of terms, a lot of concepts. What we're going to do now in part two is we're going to pivot to some more kind of like abstract or academic questions regarding public opinion. So if you want to go ahead and pause, that's fine. This is a good place to do that. Otherwise, if you're ready to keep going, we're going to start off by talking about attitude stability. In other words, how stable are our attitudes, and are we easily persuaded or not? I want to begin this section of the lecture by talking about one of the most seminal studies on public opinion in the discipline of political science. Now bear with me, I'm going to walk you through this example. Imagine you were presented with the following question. Imagine the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease which is expected to kill 600 people. 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimate of the consequences of the program are as follows. If you choose program A, it's guaranteed that 200 people will be saved. But you could choose program B, where there's a 1/3 probability that everyone is saved and a 2/3 probability that no one is saved. Now, in this classic experiment, respondents who participated in this study only got to choose between two different programs. In other words, 50% of people who participated in the study only got to choose between programs A and B, and the other half of the respondents only got to see programs C and D, which I'll talk about now. In this scenario, you can choose program C, where it's guaranteed that 400 people will die. Or you can choose program D, where there's a 1/3 probability that no one dies and a 2/3 probability that everyone dies. Now, what you have likely noticed is that these are just two different ways of framing the same outcomes. In the first scenario, where we got to choose between program A and B, program A, where 200 people are guaranteed to be saved, and then we have program B, our risky option, where there's some probabilities involved. This is our risk-averse frame, because why would we want to gamble if we know that just by choosing program A, we can automatically save 200 people? Whereas when we're choosing between programs C and D, this is our risk-seeking frame. It's risk-seeking because we have two different outcomes. Program C, where it's guaranteed that 400 people are going to die. Wow, that sounds scary. Or there's a riskier option. We could choose program D, where there's a 1/3 probability that no one dies and a 2/3 probability that everyone dies. And you'll notice that looking at these programs side by side, they are the same exact thing. They're just worded in different ways. If we choose program A and we're automatically saving 200 people, then that means that we are essentially also choosing program C, where 400 people die automatically. The difference here is that we're framing each of these programs in terms of either gains or losses. And so even though the information is technically exactly the same, what the researchers wanted to do is to see whether or not framing certain questions in terms of being risk-averse through gains frames or risk-seeking through loss frames, is that going to change people's behavior or not? In fact, I ran this same exact experiment in a section of this class last semester, and even among students, we find the same outcomes. So last semester, right, half of my students got to choose between programs A and B, and then the other half of the students only got to choose between programs C and D. And look at how opposite the responses are. When students were presented with the gains frame, that if they chose program A, they could automatically save 200 people, 62% of students were more likely to choose program A over program B. But what about students who saw the losses frame? Well, in that scenario, only about 30% of students wanted to choose program C, where there was a guarantee that 400 people would die. Instead, 70% of students who had to choose between C and D were more likely to choose program D, where there was a 1/3 probability that everyone dies, but a 2/3 probability that everyone lives. And so what's really curious here is that just by manipulating the words that are in the statement and how I frame the consequences, I was able to radically change people's opinions about this question. So I want to ask you, why do you think that we should care about these results? Why are these results significant? Why do they matter? I'll give you a moment to pause because I would love to hear your ideas about framing in the discussion board. When you're ready to proceed, hit play. Now, one of the reasons I think that we should be particularly aware of framing effects and why they matter is because they happen so often in political discourse. For context, a framing effect is a type of cognitive bias that occurs when people over-rely on their positive or negative considerations, often as a means to obtain gains or to prevent losses. We see this happen all the time in politics. Just to give you a brief example, in the way in which President Obama's key legislative accomplishment, Obamacare, was framed in the media. There are lots of really interesting studies that show that when we ask people, are you supportive of Obamacare, that there's a lot less support for the program of Obamacare. But when we ask individuals, how supportive are you of the Affordable Care Act, we see a lot more people expressing support for the Affordable Care Act. And why is this? Well, it's because it's an example of a framing effect. When we're asking people whether or not they support Obamacare, we're not really asking them whether or not they support government subsidized healthcare for most Americans. Really, when we frame the question as Obamacare, we're really asking people how they feel about Obama. And a lot of this boils down to political knowledge, which we'll talk about in just a moment later in the lecture. But you can see, just by framing issues in certain ways, we're shifting the main consideration of the question here. And politicians do this very strategically all of the time. So we should really care about the language that politicians use to frame different political questions, because as we just learned through the Kahneman and Tversky experiment, frames can have a really profound impact on how we express our opinions. I want to share with you one more study that really highlights the power of framing effects. And I want to ask you, even if we were to consider one of the most hated, despised, notorious hate groups in the country, the KKK, do you think that we could still use a frame in a particular way that might make people a little bit more tolerant of the KKK? This was the question that was central to this 1997 study by Nelson, Clausen, and Oxley. Essentially, what they wanted to know was whether people would express greater tolerance toward the KKK if their rallies were framed as free speech issues. So here in this example, you can see that there were two different frames that were presented to individuals in the study, right? They either got the free speech frame or they got the public order frame. The free speech frame emphasizing that everybody is entitled to their First Amendment right to free speech. The public order frame instead emphasizing that KKK rallies often turn violent. And without getting too much into the statistics, and I don't want to dwell on that, higher numbers here indicate greater tolerance. And what do we see? Individuals who got the free speech framing condition were significantly more tolerant of not only rallies for the KKK, but tolerance for the speeches themselves. And I think that this really underscores how powerful framing effects can be, especially if they can make individuals more tolerant of, again, even one of the most despicable hate groups in our nation's history. Just based upon the way that we frame information around these groups, we can radically change people's attitudes. And I want you to think about, if people are so easily persuaded, then should politicians be very responsive to public opinion if, in fact, it's not as stable as we think it is? Question to consider as we continue through the lecture. Next, let's move on to conspiracy theories. It seems like conspiracy theories are just about everywhere these days. Let's talk about why that is. Well, in general, most people have difficulty processing information during times of despair, uncertainty, and fear. Conspiracy theories often help explain significant and frightening world events as the malevolent acts of secret and powerful groups. Communication scholars have argued that accepting one conspiracy theory generally makes people more susceptible to beliefs in other conspiracies as well. In fact, a recent study by the Washington Post suggests that nearly 9 out of 10 Americans believe in at least one conspiracy theory. I actually have a link to that quiz right here, which I would love for you to pause the video, take the quiz. I want to see how many you get right, and I would love to hear your thoughts about these conspiracy theories in the discussion boards. Which one did you fall victim to? And why do you think Americans are so likely to believe in conspiracy theories? So if you want to go ahead and pause the video and take this quiz, go ahead and do that now before we proceed with the video. When you're ready to resume, go ahead and hit play. So why do people believe in conspiracy theories? Again, I kind of want to return to some of the points that were discussed earlier in part 1 of the lecture. Our psychological needs play a major role in shaping our worldview and our key values, beliefs, and attitudes. Conspiracy theories are beholden to the same exact factors. Research suggests that people are primarily drawn to conspiracy theories if their core psychological needs are unmet by their environment. And there's three that I want to talk about. First, let's talk about epistemic needs. This is the desire to satisfy curiosity and avoid uncertainty, a need to search for patterns and meaning in the world. What conspiracy theories do you think appeal to epistemic needs that help us satisfy curiosity and avoid uncertainty? Next, there are existential needs, the desire to restore a threatened sense of security and control. Anxiety and worry can facilitate the belief in these types of conspiracy theories. Lastly, there are social needs. This is the desire to hold oneself or group in a positive regard. The desire to feel special about oneself may influence people to believe in information that achieves this goal. And I'd like you to try to think of examples of conspiracy theories that appeal to each of these needs. And if that's a little difficult, I'll try to give you just a bit of a hint. When we're talking about epistemic needs, generally we're talking about conspiracy theories that help us make sense of a highly uncertain world around us. Generally, this revolves around scientific issues. So vaccine hesitancy is actually a really good example of conspiracy theories that appeal to epistemic needs, particularly those around COVID, right? How did they come up with the vaccine so quickly? Can I trust it? I have all this uncertainty about this topic and I don't understand how it works. Conspiracy theories can come in and provide easy to understand explanations for these complicated events. Conspiracy theories that appeal to existential needs help us feel a little bit more safer and secure. This idea that it can't possibly be the case that events this horrific actually happen in our day-to-day lives. There must be some alternative explanation. So false flag conspiracy theories are a really good example. The idea that when horrific school shootings occur, that they're not real, they're false flag events. There's some secret organization that has paid all of these crisis actors to pretend that there's a problem, right? That's an example of an existential conspiracy theory. It helps restore our sense of security by suggesting that truly horrific events, there's no way that they could actually happen. They must be a fabrication. And then QAnon is a good example of social need-oriented conspiracy theories, right? This idea that there is a group, a collective of individuals online who really know the truth about what's actually going on in politics, and that helps us feel special, that we have this privileged information, we're different from the rest of society. Also, conspiracy theories that target religious minorities or racial minorities or women that can make you feel better about your group by blaming certain events on outgroups are other examples of social needs-oriented conspiracy theories as well. Anyway, I know I kind of gave you one little example of each of those, but I would love to hear, what conspiracy theories have you heard or do you see on social media, and which need do you think that those appeal to based on the slide here. Moving on, let's talk about how we measure public opinion and identify quality polls. So we're going to talk about the characteristics of reliable polls, understanding what the margin of error is, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about how informed the public is by examining how Americans answer political knowledge questions. There's just a few things I would like you to know about the characteristics of good polls. Good polls must first be randomized, which means everyone in the target population has an equal chance of being selected. And second, good polls must be representative, which means that the sample represents the target population. And there's lots of things that we could consider here to help us determine whether or not a poll was randomized and representative. So first, we have to make sure that whoever the target population is, that everyone in that population has an equal chance of being selected. So for instance, if we wanted to interview as many Americans as possible and ask them, a simple question about whether they think Joe Biden is currently doing a good job as president or not. Our target population are all Americans in the United States. And let's say that we use a sampling method like random digit dial on landline households. Does everyone in the target population have an equal chance of being selected if we only use the method of landline phone calls to ask this question? No, that's not very randomized because there's millions of Americans who don't have landlines, right? So that would not be a very randomized method for contacting our target population. Next, we have to consider whether the sample is representative. Again, if the target population are all Americans in the United States, but we only call people in Wisconsin, that's not representative either. We know that Wisconsin politically is very unique. It's a battleground state. It's much different than voters who live in California or New York or Oklahoma or Texas, right? So we have to make sure that our samples are representative of the population as well. A few other points to remember. Good polls also minimize bias by avoiding things like poor question wording and framing, like we just discussed earlier. Good polls will have a sample size of roughly 1,000 respondents. We'll talk about why this matters in just a moment. And then sampling technique is also really important, just as we discussed through the randomization example. And I want to take a moment to address some of the criticism that political polls have undergone, especially since the 2016 election. So generally, when we're getting close to election time, you'll see a flurry of articles, much like this one that I have on the screen now, about why you can't trust the polls and why polls are bad and they're full of bias and this and that. I'm here as a social scientist who has expertise in public opinion polling to tell you that there's some untruths going on here. And while yes, there is some degree of truth to the claim that, we shouldn't trust every poll that we see, we need to make sure that we are meeting the criteria discussed in the slide previous before we put all of our hopes and dreams into one very specific poll that we saw highlighted on TikTok, right? And I want to introduce a resource to you that I think is really, really great at cataloging all of the different polls that are collected during an election cycle. And that's the website Real Clear Politics. And what I love about this website is that they don't just look at one poll that was conducted in Wisconsin or one poll that was conducted in Florida to make estimates about which candidate's going to win in 2024. What they do is they take all of these polls across the 50 states, and they look at the average margins in those polls to make estimates about which candidate they think will win in 2024. And so we can see a really good example here, right? Out of the hundreds of polls, the ones that have the most reliability, right? What happens when we average those estimates together to try to get a really clear picture of how the candidates are polling right now? So I'm recording this lecture on August 12th, and here's the most recent data availability from Real Clear Politics. They've got data current to August 8th. And what we can see is that based upon the national polling averages from all of these polling institutes that are constantly polling the American public, on average, Harris actually has a very small lead at the moment. We can see how that lead has slowly eclipsed Trump, especially since Biden's exit of the race in late July. So yes, we should never rely on just one poll conducted in, one state or, one ABC poll that tries to poll everybody in the country, right? We should never rely on just one poll to make predictions about the outcome of an election. I instead encourage you to use resources like Real Clear Politics that aggregate hundreds of polls, because that gives us the best estimates possible about how the nation is feeling about these two candidates. And again, you'll hear things like, well, the polls totally got it wrong in 2016. Why were the polls so off in 2016? And in fact, they're not. Again, when we go to Real Clear Politics archives and we look at the aggregate results of polling data, we see that on average, Hillary Clinton was expected to have about 46% of the vote compared to Donald Trump's 43% of the vote. And that's exactly what we saw, right? Clinton actually outperformed RCP's estimates, right? Hillary Clinton got about 48% of the popular vote compared to Donald Trump's 46%. Don't forget, Hillary Clinton got 2 million more votes than Donald Trump did. But I think the reason that people are under the impression that, the polls, they all got it wrong, is because of the weird electoral rules that we have in this country. And that even though Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by more than 2 million votes, she didn't beat him in the right states, which is why she did not secure the 270 electoral votes needed to clinch the election. Again, I don't want to get too much into the Electoral College right now. We're going to come back to it when we get to voting and campaigns and that type of content. So don't worry, we're going to come back to it. But the moral of the story here is that we can trust polls more than the media suggests that we should. Just a couple other things I wanted to touch on when it comes to identifying quality polls. The number one thing that you should look out for is polling transparency. Before you start sharing public opinion data with someone or making an opinion based upon data that you have seen or read about, you should always make sure that these three things are available, or that they are transparently published with the data that you're reading about. So first, you should always be able to review the questions that are asked in a poll. You want to make sure that these questions are worded without any type of glaring bias. Second, you want to check the sample size. The sample size should be around 1,000 in order for us to have a lot of confidence in those results. And then third, we should always pay attention to the sampling technique. So how were respondents contacted when it comes to the participation in the study? So question wording is really, really important, right? If we came across some type of poll that said, well, according to this poll, 80% of Americans believe that the state of the nation right now is in a terrible state. And we say 80% believe that the nation's in a terrible state. Wow, that sounds really high. I'd like to know more information about this study and how the questions were worded. That's a really important exercise to go through, because when we have access to how the questions were worded, we can determine if there was any type of bias involved in that process. And here's where I want to introduce you to the concept of push polls. Push polls seem like public opinion polls, but they're actually marketing techniques with the true objective of swaying voters by using manipulative questions. So here, let's just look at the question wording and the response options presented in this push poll that was actually sent to me a couple months ago. So here's the question. How would you rate the state of our nation right now? Terrible, horrible, very bad, or all of the above? First of all, how is terrible worse than horrible, or is terrible like the most extreme option and very bad means that like I can kind of live with it? So like, first of all, this scale doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't understand which response option is technically more extreme than the other. And really what I can, there's not even any response options for like, maybe I feel positively about the state of the nation right now. There aren't even any response options for me to express that attitude. So there's all kinds of things wrong. We can tell that just by looking at these questions that this is an anti-Joe Biden poll. And it's the point of this is not to collect any meaningful data about how I actually feel about the state of the nation or Joe Biden. This is just a marketing technique. This is a push poll, and its whole purpose is just to remind me about how much I hate Joe Biden. Next, let's talk about sample size and margin of error. Now, this is really important. I want you to understand that the more responses that we have in a poll, the more confident we can be that our results are representative. And remember, that's a key criteria of a good opinion poll. So you will see this as an exam question, and I want you to remember this graph when you see this question on the exam. As sample size increases, the likelihood of data errors decreases, which means that the more and more people that we have in a poll, the closer that we get to those true population estimates, of course, we're going to have much less error in our data. And so just think about it this way, right? Which poll would you trust more? Which poll would you trust to be more accurate? One that interviews 5 people or one that interviews 5,000 people? Of course, the poll that interviews 5,000 people is going to have much less error compared to the poll that only has 5 people. And generally, we use 1,000 as a pretty firm cutoff for when it comes to public opinion data. Having about 1,000 respondents means that we're going to have about a 3% margin of error, which generally most people can live with. And then lastly, I wanted you just to consider sampling technique. We already kind of discussed this in the example above where we were talking about random digit dialing of landline households and how, well, yeah, we can think of examples of how that's not very representative because not everybody has a landline. I want you to think about other pros and cons with some of the more common sampling techniques, like mail, for instance. What kind of sample are you going to get back if you're trying to gauge public opinion by sending out mailers to people? And, are you including postage? Prepaid postage or not. And we can think about the varying degrees of effort that are involved in your participation in each of these. What about somebody who comes door to door and knocks on your door and wants to ask you a couple of questions? What are the pros and cons of that sampling technique method? Or pros and cons with internet surveys or surveys that are sent directly to your phone via text message. I think with each of these, the biggest con that we can think about is that, each of these require a degree of effort. And people probably have to have some kind of inclination to already care about politics in the first place. Or they have to be particularly knowledgeable about politics, right? Like if you don't feel like you're tuned into politics, you don't care about what's going on, somebody reaches out to you to ask your opinion about politics. I mean, if you don't care enough about the issues, or you're jaded about politics, you're probably just going to hang up on that person, or you're not going to take the survey. You're not going to take the time to complete it. So we also have to really consider, out of the people who do decide to respond to these polls, how might those individuals be different than individuals who still vote, they still participate in government, but maybe they just don't have enough time, energy, or effort to participate in a poll? We have to consider those dynamics when trying to understand the reliability of polling in the United States. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Let's talk about political knowledge. I'm not going to do the official stop and think, but do think for a moment. I'll give you the whole cue to pause. But I want you to think about how informed do you think most Americans are about politics? Do you think that, I bet that 70 to 80% of Americans, they can probably answer basic civics questions about American government? Or do you think that it's abysmal, 10% of Americans know that there's 3 branches of government? Do you think that's just absolutely awful? Take a moment to pause and think, and I want you to think, how knowledgeable do you think most Americans are about politics? And then I'll reveal some answers. Okay, so what I'm about to share with you is some data from the 2020 American National Election Studies Survey. This is a massive study that has hundreds of questions on it. It's super cool data. If you're a political science major or a social science major and you want to do any type of public opinion data analysis, this is such a cool resource. I think they've got public opinion data that goes back to the 70s or 80s. So we're going to look at 2020 results. I just have them summarized on the next slide of how knowledgeable Americans are about politics in this country. So let's get started. So about 50% of Americans know that the Supreme Court decides whether laws are constitutional or not. So only about half of Americans could correctly answer what the Supreme Court does. About half of Americans could name all three branches of government, so the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branch, right? That's kind of scary. 25% could not list a single protection in the First Amendment. Okay. 47% knew that Congress can override a presidential veto, that Congress does in fact have that power. Earlier, when we talked about the Washington Post article, the Washington Post survey on conspiracy theories, 90% of Americans believe in at least one conspiracy. That's a little frightening. We also talked about how framing effects in political discourse make it really difficult to understand Americans' true preferences because they are so easily persuaded by framing effects. And then lastly, about 75% of Americans cannot distinguish between a real news headline and a fake news headline. Moreover, when we look at media trends in this country, we see that only about 32% of Americans report that they follow national politics very closely. So, based upon the responses to these questions, the fact that over 90% of Americans believe in at least one conspiracy theory, and the implications that we've uncovered in this lecture about the power and persuasion of framing effects, I want to end with, do you think that politicians should be responsive to public opinion? If the public is lacking critical civics information about how our government works, if the public is too eager to buy into conspiracy theories and fake news, if we're so easily persuaded by information via framing effects, should politicians be responsive to public opinion or not? And I've got just a few prompts here that suggest why, yes, politicians should definitely be responsive to public opinion. And I've got some prompts here in the no column for no, maybe politicians shouldn't be responsive to public opinion, and maybe we should rethink the relationship between members in our society and the individuals we elect to represent us at the national level. Ultimately, I would love to see this debate play out in the discussion board, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this question. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and wrap up with our final thoughts. In today's lecture, we discussed the origins and influences on public opinion. We've examined the stability of public opinion and the power of persuasion. We talked about the critical role that psychology and cognitive bias play in shaping our attitudes. And then we had some fun, I think, discussing belief in conspiracy theories and how those are largely met by unmet psychological needs. And then we discussed the state of political knowledge and whether or not politicians should be responsive to the will of the public. So that's all I have for you guys today. I really hope you enjoyed today's lecture. As always, thanks so much for watching. I can't wait to read your thoughts in the discussion board, and I'll see you in the next one.